When I was 17 years old, my mom took me to see a psychologist. I sat in a chair and stared out the window while my mom told the psychologist about how I'd been sleeping too much, how I'd been irritable, and how I just wasn't myself. They ran a bunch of tests on me, and about 4 hours later, they handed me this packet. It was about a quarter of an inch thick, and on the front, there was a list of things that they had decided were wrong with me. Now, the list was kind of long, but it boiled down to two things. The first thing was depression, and at that point, I wasn't really surprised. I'd known for a while that something was wrong with me, that I wasn't really functioning in my normal way. But the second thing on that list was ADHD, and that was really surprising to me. You see, I didn't fit the stereotype of the kids with ADHD. I got good grades, I was relatively well-behaved, I'd like to think, but I actually told the doctors that they were wrong and that they should run some more tests because ADHD definitely wasn't the answer. The doctors very nicely sat down with me and explained the two diagnoses. They said that having ADHD meant that my brain worked a little bit differently than everybody else's. It meant that my mind was always going a little bit faster than the world around me. This had caused some problems for me. They said it explained things like my compulsive eating, my need to say whatever was on my mind the second I thought of it, and my need to relentlessly pursue any decision I made in the instant that I made it. But at the same time, they told me that ADHD was just a word for the way that my mind worked. Now, depression, on the other hand, was totally different. Depression wasn't a way that my mind worked, it was something that changed the way my mind worked. Depression was like this dark fog that came into my mind and it gummed up all the works. Every little task took enormous energy. If I was already jumping over mental hurdles with my ADHD to focus or to concentrate, depression just made those hurdles 10 feet taller. Now, I was lucky enough to receive treatment the summer after I finished high school. I was lucky enough to get better, and by that fall, when I came here to the University of Chicago, I felt like my slate had been wiped clean. I was ready to study psychology and biology. I had this idea in mind that I could answer the question, what is mental illness? What is it that happened to me last summer? Now, the first stop I made on the journey of answering this question was the internet, as it is for so many of us. What I found right away was this social movement that existed for destigmatization, which basically means that there was a group of people and organizations that was working really hard to reduce the stigma attached to mental illness. And that stigma is this idea that people with mental illness are somehow bad or wrong, or they deserve the suffering that they have to endure. Now, there's a core rhetoric that's used in this movement that people rely on to explain what it's like to have mental illness to people who don't understand. They liken mental illness to a physical illness or an injury. They say things like, you wouldn't tell someone with a broken arm to just get over it. You'd tell them to go to the doctor and get treatment and be healed. And it's the same with mental illness. Now, this rhetoric is based on what I now know is the pathological model of mental illness. So with the pathological model, what we have is this idea that there's a normal way that a person's brain works for any given person, and we're going to represent that here with these gears that I have in this brain space. Now, these gears turn, meaning they're functional, but sometimes something can happen, something can come into your mind that prevents those gears from turning. Now, what happens at that point is you start to change. You change in a way that society can see. And when they see that change, when they see that something's wrong with you, they give you that label of abnormal. Now, using this model for treatment means that you direct the treatment at removing the pathogen, the thing that's causing the mental illness. So for instance, if we go back here, if we remove this, you can see that the gears are able to spin again. Now, this model was something I actively embraced in my early days of this adventure. I decided that it really described my mental illness, and I think the reason for that was because this conception that that my mental illnesses were somehow different or separate from me, that's part of what helped me heal. This notion that these things weren't part of me, that I wasn't lazy, I was depressed, or I wasn't mean and rude, I had ADHD. Those things made me feel like I deserved to get better. But I think even then, in the back of my mind, I knew that this pathological model really couldn't be the whole answer to the question of what is mental illness. Because you see, I'd noticed some really important differences between my ADHD and my depression. You may have even picked up on them when I talked about it before. But the biggest thing that I saw was this idea that depression was something that happened to me. It had a start and an end, it could be resolved, and it happened over a specific period of time. It stopped me from being my normal self. ADHD, on the other hand, was just who I was. It was just a word to describe the way my mind worked, and it was relatively permanent. The other thing I noticed was this idea that the treatment that I received for both these conditions seemed to have different motivations. You see, with depression, the treatment that I received seemed to line up with what the pathological model described. That idea that we were trying to get rid of the thing that was hurting me, get rid of the pathogen, and get me back to normal. But with my ADHD, the medication and the therapy that I had seemed much more directed at changing the way that I was, at changing my behavior, at changing my thoughts, at making me seem more normal. And that didn't really seem like something that worked in the pathological model. The ADHD didn't seem to be explained enough by this pathological model, so I sought a new one. I went out searching for more answers, and I was lucky enough to find them. There are several psychologists who would argue that the pathological model of mental illness only applies to a few very serious disorders, where the way of thinking that a person has is harmful to them in some way. But the rest of mental illness, the rest of the things that we call mental illnesses, are just labels that society puts on ways of thinking that are, for some reason, unacceptable. Now, this model is called the cultural model. With the cultural model, we start with this idea that there's a normal way of thinking. You'll see we've returned to our 3 gears. There's a normal way or a range of ways that people can think. Now, there's also other ways of thinking that are slightly different in some way and usually less common. You'll see in this case, we have 4 gears instead of 3. Now, that slightly different way of thinking makes those people seem different to society. They appear different. But the important part of this is that both of these ways of thinking are equally valid and equally functional. As you can see, both of these sets of gears spin just fine. But because this one looks different, because it produces something that society sees as different or wrong, we call it abnormal. Now, under this model, the treatment you receive is directed at changing the way that you appear to society, at making you seem more normal. So at this point in my journey, I had these 2 models, right? I had the pathological model and the cultural model, and they were somewhat at odds with each other. With the pathological model, we had this notion that mental illnesses were these invaders that prevent normal functioning, that they were transient, they had an onset and a resolution, and that under this model, treatment should be directed at eliminating the pathogen and restoring normal functioning. But with the cultural model, we had a different idea. We had this idea that mental illness was just a label that people put on things that are normal functioning for certain people. These things are relatively static ways of thinking, or permanent, and in this case, treatment is geared towards restoring or towards appearing normal to the rest of society. Now, these 2 models obviously struck different chords with me, but they both rang true. For instance, the pathological model seemed to explain my depression, but the cultural model seemed to explain my ADHD. Since I couldn't answer my question of what is mental illness with 2 different models, I decided to try to find a way to reconcile them. My first step was to conduct a little bit of research. You see, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't creating a new theory just based on what I thought about my own conditions. I wanted to make sure I was talking to some other people too. So I reached out and interviewed about, I think it was 52 people. And these 52 people talked with me about their conditions. They'd all been diagnosed with mental illness. They talked to me about how those conditions related to their concepts of self and identity, and they talked to me a little bit about these two different models. Every person I spoke to endorsed one of these models as being more descriptive of their condition. But they also all acknowledged that both of these models were valid and made sense, and that they obviously were in some sort of contradiction. So at this point, seeing as I knew that it wasn't just in my own head, I moved forward with what I call my new theory of the way that we can understand mental illness. So my starting point for developing this new theory was to take these definitions and these two models and find out what it was that they had in common. What was it that united them? The common thread that I found was this notion of what it means to be normal. Now, when I went to actually write this theory down, I realized that normal has a lot of definitions. It's applicable in a lot of fields. So I decided to narrow the scope a little bit and to use a different term, which we're going to use mental normality. Now, the term mental normality for our purposes today means the range of possible behaviors, thoughts, feelings, or ways of thinking that any person can have over their lifetime. Now, mental normality is typically conceived of as a single spectrum, as you're either normal or you're not, and all of these variations that you can possibly have take place on a single spectrum. But instead of doing that, what I want to propose to you today is that we think of mental normality as two distinct and separate dimensions, and those are individual normality and social normality. And these two dimensions can come together to create the entire concept of mental normality. So we're going to take these one at a time. The first one is individual normality. With individual normality, you start with this idea that there's a range of behaviors and thoughts and feelings that a given individual can have over their lifetime. Now, within this range, there's a smaller range, and that range is the normal behaviors and thoughts and feelings that that person can have, that they consider to be normal. Every individual sets the margins of this range for themselves. Now, this implies on the converse that there's also behaviors and thoughts and feelings that aren't normal, that are what we call pathological. Now, we call these pathological because we assume that everyone has this goal of trying to function in their normal way at all times. And so if they're up here in the red area, it's because something's wrong. Now, these margins are the same as the individual margins because they line up exactly. The important part of the individual dimension is that every individual sets these margins for themselves. So for instance, this particular dimension could represent one individual, but this other dimension could represent another individual that has a wider margin of normal behavior, and this third one could represent yet another. Every individual determines what is normal for them, and this helps explain why we see such a wide variety of symptoms in pathological mental illness. When I say pathological mental illness, I mean things like depression or anxiety, things that push you from this green area, from this normal, up into the red, and prevent you from functioning as normal. Those are what we call pathological mental illnesses. But what about ADHD? We've been talking about that a lot. I've mentioned it quite a few times. That obviously is not on that spectrum. For that, we're going to go to the second spectrum. We're going to go to social normality. With social normality, we have a dimension again, and this encompasses all of the possible ways of thinking that any individual can have. Now, this dimension doesn't look at a single individual over time, but it looks at individuals, differences between individuals at a given point in time. Now, within this dimension, there is, again, a range of behavior, ways of thinking that are considered normal. But these margins of what is normal aren't determined by an individual. They're determined by society as a whole. We, as a society, are the ones that determine where these margins go. Now, there are also certain ways of thinking that are harmful to people, and we call those the pathological ways of thinking on the social dimension. And those boundaries are much farther out on the outside. Now, you'll notice that, as opposed to the individual normality dimension, this dimension's boundaries don't line up. There's all of this gray space in the middle. And in this gray space is where we see conditions like ADHD and autism spectrum disorder and certain learning disabilities. all of the people that are in these spaces, that are on the margins, they live in a world where their way of thinking is called wrong, is told that they are somehow broken. And they spend their entire lives trying to make sure that they can appear as normal as possible. So why does this all matter? Why does it matter if we have one dimension or two, or which model answers my question that none of you asked, only I did? Why does it matter? Well, you remember I mentioned that notion of the social movement towards destigmatization, and that's really important. I told you about how in that movement, they're making really good strides to reduce the stigma that's associated with mental illness, and I commend them for that. I think it's really important that we make sure that the people with mental illness aren't relegated to any lives that are lesser than the rest of us. But I also think it's important that we spread the most accurate information as possible. When people in this movement for destigmatization use rhetoric that's based on the pathological model, like likening mental illness to physical illness, that alienates the part of the population that suffers from mental illness that's not pathological. If someone tells me that depression is like breaking my leg, my immediate response is, so then what's ADHD? Does that mean that I'm broken? I'm not broken, and that's important to remember. We need to remember that as we move forward with this destigmatization, that we do it for all and not at the expense of some. The other thing that I think this theory can help us with is the idea of social responsibility. Like I told you before, that margin of normality on the social normality dimension, we decide that. We're responsible for making sure, or for determining where those boundaries go and who is relegated to the margins. We're responsible for the notion that some people are wrong. So the next time you go to make a judgment about that, I hope you think about it a little bit deeper. Is ADHD an illness because it's harmful in some way, or because it makes people less productive? Is autism a disorder because it's harmful, or because it makes people less sociable? These are questions that I hope my theory can answer. It's important to remember that just because someone is less capable or less sociable or thinks differently, that it doesn't mean they're any less human. Whether they bear the burden of a cultural label of a mental illness or they suffer from a pathological mental illness, they're people and they deserve to be treated as such. My hope is that someday we can live in a world where this stigma of people with mental illness has been eliminated in its entirety once and for all. Thank you.